Ladies and gentlemen, let's Red Gaming Telecom video. We're still going to be continuing my thoughts and opinions on the recent comments that Albert Penello has made regarding the Xbox One. Now, we're going to be discussing ESRAM primarily in this video. And why one video dedicated purely to ESRAM? Surely that's overkill. My friends, it is not enough kill. This is one of the most controversial areas of the Xbox One's design. Now, we're going to very quickly go into what it is in terms of, what the purpose is, and its functions. I'm sure most of you will know this stuff anyway, but just in case you're not familiar with it, it will just help to, familiarize you with it. And then we're going to go into my thoughts, opinions, and some comparisons, and so on. Now, there are a couple of things we have to get out of the way first. Firstly, Microsoft have not confirmed all of this stuff. In other words, some of this is by both my own and other people's best guess. So some of this stuff has simply not been confirmed. We're basically just hoping that we are pretty right based on some pretty decent guesswork and, experience and so on, as well as some Microsoft slides. So, if in 2 days' time I put out a new video with new information because, for example, Albert Penello has decided to, give us more information, so be it. That's just how tech works, unfortunately, and that's just one of the problems, of course, with NDAs and talking about hardware that's not been released. So anyway, I'm pretty sure all of you all know that anyway, but I just wanted to put it out there. So of course, what is the ESRAM? ESRAM is basically Microsoft's way of helping to make up for the disparity between the GDDR5 memory of the PlayStation 4, which of course, as we all know by now, is running 176 gigabytes per second. This is using a 256-bit memory bus. Moreover, that's also, of course, using 5500 megahertz RAM. That's effective speed. Now, the Xbox One's memory system is a little bit different, and by a little bit I mean quite drastically different. There are two memory sources that really we're going to be talking about now. That technically there is coherent and non-coherent memory, but we're not really going to discuss that for a moment because I want to make this as simple as possible. Coherent memory is primarily what is going to be feeding the GPU as far as what we understand it. For intents and purposes, that is 30 gigabytes per second. In addition to that, of course, you do have the non-coherent memory bandwidth. That's 68 gigabytes per second total. So 68 gigabytes per second, or if you're just counting the coherent area, that's 30, okay? So it's not like it's 30 plus 68. I just want to clarify that. It's 30 with coherent, non-coherent, it's 68 gigabytes. Okay, hopefully that's all understood. I'm going to really clarify this because there is a lot of different questions that I'm getting, and I think everyone's on slightly different pages regarding this, so I'm going to try and clarify it as much as possible to begin with. Next one is the ESRAM. Now, the ESRAM is a huge cause of contention by and in and of itself. Okay, so what exactly is ESRAM? We'll go into its specifications in a moment. 32 megabytes of the stuff is packed on to the Xbox One and has a pretty simple purpose. It's basically there to act as a sort of cache, as a sort of, this is really fast memory, we're going to put stuff on here and, there you have it. In other words, it's there as kind of a, what's the best way to put this? As an insurance policy. Memory GPUs, and by GPUs I mean any of the recent ones, so in this case the PlayStation 4s, Xbox Ones and modern day PC ones, require a hell of a lot of memory bandwidth to feed them. I'm sure you all know this, but a GPU is often memory bandwidth starved. In other words, there's not enough data being fed to the GPU, therefore the GPU can't process the data, and therefore the GPU is simply just waiting, and it's basically wasting CPU cycles. To put it another way, so we're all clear, let's assume that the GPU clock speed is 800 megahertz, and let's assume that let's just assume that we're using the PS4 as an example because it's a hell of a lot easier to explain. Let's just assume that the Xbox One's, that the PlayStation 4 has 176 gigabytes per second of memory bandwidth, and let's just assume suddenly that, there's a button that can be magically pressed, and if you press this, it doubles the amount of GCN cores inside the PlayStation 4. That would make it from 18 to 36. So that would mean that you're getting about 3.68 teraflops of computing power, just for those who are curious. But let's assume that the memory bandwidth of the PlayStation 4 remained constant. In other words, memory bandwidth wasn't doubled, there wasn't higher bus rate, whatever, exactly the same memory bandwidth, and so on. What would happen? It wouldn't make a difference. In other words, the GPU simply wouldn't have enough data processing fast enough. So, in other words, you're getting hugely wasted cycles. So, in other words, the GPUs are simply waiting for it. I'm sure that's all abundantly clear. And this, on the other hand, is also the primary cause of contention for the Xbox One. This is one of the major concerns that people have with the system. Now, I went about this a roundabout way because I wanted to point this out really carefully. There are several issues with the Xbox One that people are concerned with. The main one most people are worried about is the ESRAM is a very small pool of memory. It's 32 megabytes, and we're going to go into that just now. So there's a couple of issues. Firstly, people aren't exactly sure how Microsoft are working out the bandwidth with the ESRAM. They're not exactly sure how efficient the ESRAM is, and people are worried that there's not going to be enough memory. And directly related to not enough memory would be the hit rate. Hit rate, by the way, is the chance of you having a piece of data that is relevant to what you wish to process, right? So it's kind of like going into a store and saying, do you have this item? Well, okay, if you go into your local supermarket and you ask for a loaf of bread or a can of beans, there's a good chance that they're going to have that. On the other hand, if you walk into, your local, video game store and ask them for a can of beans, it's not really going to go well for you. Now, the same thing goes, of course, to any shop. The bigger the shop is, the more chance is that they are going to have a decent stock of the thing that you want. So I'm pretty sure that that's a good explanation. I'm sure many of you will understand that. So the purpose here is, is 32 megabytes going to be enough memory? How are Microsoft calculating that memory as well? And then there are other issues as well that seem to be coming from all this. For example, can you really add the memory up? In other words, can you say, well, okay, this is 68 gigabytes per second of memory, add this to the ESRAM, and that gives you your total. And there are so many other causes of contention as well, but we'll go into those in just a moment. Okay, so let's go with the first mystery of the ESRAM. The first mystery of the ESRAM is, what is the actual bloody bandwidth of it? I point this out so emphatically because it's a real mystery. Microsoft are quoting that well, actually, you know what? I'm just going to read you out the quote. We have more memory bandwidth. This is from Albert Penello. We have more memory bandwidth, 176 gigabytes peak on paper for the GDDR5. He's regarding the PS4. Then he says our peak on paper is 272. That is including 68 gigabytes per second of DDR3, and then the 204 gigabytes per second of ESRAM. Right, so let's look at that number, 204 gigabytes per second ESRAM. ESRAM can also read-write cycles simultaneously, so I see the number misquoted. Okay, so let's go with that figure right there. Okay, so he stated 204 gigabytes per second of ESRAM. Okay, so let's first of all go with how you're calculating this, because it's a bit of a mystery. You can feel free to get your calculators out if you wish, you don't have to, but basically the memory is held in 128 bytes per block on memory, as far as what we understand it, of course. So what you can do, we can easily follow this along. You can take 128 and you times that by 800. Before anyone says the GPU speed, I know what it is, but hear me out for just a moment. So if you times 128 times 800, you'll see you have the 1.24 gigs which pops up, right? Now, Microsoft after that to their credit, they said, well, okay, we didn't realize that our silicon can do read and write operations simultaneously. I'm sorry, I'll just repeat that. So, in other words, beforehand they believed that while it was reading, it could write. While it was writing, it couldn't read. Okay, pretty obvious stuff. So, what they're saying is that the final production silicon, that ain't true. So, great job, Microsoft, is basically, what they're saying to themselves. By the way, I'm not having a go at Microsoft on this. I'm not arguing against them. I'm just pointing out the questions that no one understands right now, okay? So, if you say 102 gigabytes per second, and then you times that by 2, you get 204.8 gigabytes per second. That makes sense, right? So, the question is, of course, that that's not what the GPU clock speed is working on now. It's indeed working at 853 megahertz. So, that would be 218 gigabytes per second total. That would, of course, be, exactly the same amount of bytes, and then you times that by 853, and then you can times that by 2, and that gives you 218. So, people aren't sure how that number's coming about. That's the bottom line. People are coming up with different explanations, people are coming up with different theories, but that doesn't explain anything, right? So, we're not really sure how that's coming about. Secondly, onto that exact same issue, because it is quite a controversial topic. What exactly is the optimum speed? Because, you see, this is the theoretical maximum. In other words, this is best case scenario stuff. So, if it's not, the best case scenario, developers are stating, and Microsoft is saying, well, it's probably going to be more like, 2/3 that. Maybe a little bit better, maybe a little bit worse. So between 120 and 140 gigabytes per second memory bandwidth. But once again, we're still not exactly sure how they're coming up with those figures to begin with. Now, once again, I'm not criticizing Microsoft for this. I'm simply saying that I want to know how those figures come about. Because if you say that, something does something, I'm not arguing against how it works. I'm just saying that I want to know how it works. This is actually something that I've been very vocal about, because this is another cause of contention that I have with companies like, for example, Blizzard, and this is going slightly off topic, but for example, I remember playing WoW all the way back in, the Burning Crusade and Wrath of the Lich King and so on, and, Blizzard would come out and they would say, well, according to our internal numbers, this. And back then, the players would ask, well, how are you coming up with those numbers? Because the numbers that we're coming up with don't, measure up with yours. So we're not saying that you're lying to us. I'm not saying that you're wrong. We just want to know how you're testing it, so then we can all be on the same page. And Blizzard wouldn't answer them a lot of the time. And that's how these... this is basically how issues start, right? Because if everyone is measuring something in a different way, but you're not stating how you're measuring it, then you start to have problems. Okay, so second problem. And as I said, there are numerous issues with ESRAM. I'm not saying it's a bad design, I'm just saying that, once again, to reiterate that we're not really sure how efficient it is. But okay, another issue is, how efficient is it going to be? How effective is it going to be? Now, this really depends on your perspective. Some people are saying it's going to be amazing, and it's really going to help make up the gap between the two systems, and, well, the memory between the two systems, and others aren't. Now, one thing I would like to point out, because most people are immediately comparing the GDDR5 memory with the PlayStation 4 and the ESRAM and so on of the Xbox One, there's a couple of things we have to remember. One is tiled resources, we'll go into that in a moment, and the second is the fact that there are less GCN units, CUs, compute units, on the Xbox One. There are significantly less, they're 18 versus 12. That inherently means, because they're basically using the same CPU, admittedly we're not sure about the PlayStation 4's clock speed yet, but even let's give them that the Xbox One's clock speed is higher than the PlayStation 4's. It's not been confirmed, but the best guess we have right now is the PS4 is running at 1.6, so I'm going to go with that figure. Obviously, if you're watching this in a month's time and that's no longer the case, then you'll have to, adjust it accordingly. But let's assume that there is the Golf. There's the 1.6 of the PS4 and the 1.75 of the Xbox One. Okay, but we know in terms of raw performance, in other words, the amount of memory bandwidth that a part takes, well, we can use PCs, for example. A PC, in terms of, even the highest range PC, is using DDR3, and we're not really having an issue with that, is what it comes down to. The DDR3 memory on the CPU side is absolutely fine for the most part. It's the dedicated GPUs which really suck up the memory, and this is exactly the same thing as the PS4. The memory link on the CPU side of the PlayStation 4, so in other words, the main memory to the CPU is about 20 gigabytes per second. It's not been confirmed by Sony, but best case scenario, about 20 gigabytes per second, which is more than enough to feed the Jaguar. As I've said before, it could be 1,000 gigabytes per second link. Obviously, it can't be, because of physics and all, and the real resources. But still, even if it was, 100 gigabytes per second, for example, a realistic figure, it won't matter because the CPU can't use it anyway. So 20 gigabytes per second makes sense. It doesn't use up all the wires and everything else, so it's fine. So that means that Sony have about, completely and utterly untechnical, 156 gigabytes per second of memory bandwidth to play with the compute units, right? The actual GPU side of things. It's not exactly technical to say that, but still. So my point being that because Sony do have a more GPU power, it's not really exactly fair for people to say that, well, you know what, you need equal memory bandwidth with the PS4, because you don't. Simply because the PS4 has an advantage in CU. Now, obviously, the Xbox One does have faster GPU in terms of clock speed, and that's the important thing. Obviously, they've gone up from the previous clock speed, 800 to 853, as we discussed earlier, which is not a bad increase in clock speed. It's, just under 7%, not shabby. No one's going to, turn that down. But the important part of all of this is it's not the clock speed, it's the fact that, we understand that you don't need so much memory bandwidth because you simply have less compute units to begin with. So I'm really hoping that that's easily understood by everyone. Now we're going to go into tiled resources. Now, another argument that I'm hearing from people over the internet, and we're talking everything here, I'm not talking about one website, I've literally looked at about a dozen, right? And I've been doing a lot of reading over the last couple of days. And I've looked at everything from the dodgy websites, the ones that you don't normally want to go to tech, to like NeoGAF, to Beyond 3D, and Anantech, and everything else you can imagine. I'm just looking at different people's opinions, researching it myself. One theory that people have is tiled resources. Now, tiled resources, as it turns out, is a DirectX 11.2, he says, trying to remember, 11.2 edition. There's going to be two options. Well, not two options, but there's two versions of it. One on the Xbox One, and one specifically designed for the PC market. The premise is that it's supposed to save memory and memory bandwidth, and how it does this, and I have done another video on tiled resources, so if you're unsure you can check that out. I'm going to give you a very brief overview because this video is already turning fairly lengthy. But effectively all it does is it just swaps out crappy versions of the textures as you get closer. So let's just make up game distances. Let's assume that you're playing, I don't know, Battlefield, right? Oh, actually, let's not use Battlefield. Let's say Halo. And you are a good distance away from a distant object. Let's say, in game terms, it's 100 feet, right? So let's say 100 footsteps away. That step away, you don't need a high level of detail because you are too far away in reality, just as you would be with your eyes, to see a lot of detail on that texture. Therefore, it makes sense from the perspective of everyone and their mother, to not waste compute cycles on that object. In real life, the detail is still there. It doesn't disappear if you're not looking at it. In video game terms, however, just how I showed you how, for example, clipping works, and you can check that video out on the channel, but in this, it's a simple case of the closer you get to an object, the more detail that is required to make that object look good. And this is one of the issues that, of course, the Xbox 360 and PS3 games have compared to, say, PC, that they have crappy looking textures because they don't have enough memory to store those textures, right? Because large textures obviously take a lot of memory, a lot of graphics memory, okay? So one of the theories is that tiled resources will help by effectively reducing the amount of memory bandwidth required and swapping data basically as a thing comes close. So let's assume that you're playing a game and you're really far away from some dude. As you get closer, the textures, which obviously even characters have textures, yeah? Grass has textures, trees has textures, everything has textures, and that's what the TMUs do, texture mapping units. Of course, they take a texture, which is basically, consider it like an image, and they wrap it around geometry or an object, okay? Pretty simple stuff. So the theory is that tiled resources will act to help negate the memory bandwidth deficit of the Xbox One as well. That's one theory, so let's talk about a little bit more. Now, there is some argument as well that's going about exactly how the memory is being used. In other words, is it going to be a true cache? Is it going to be software managed? And a lot more besides. To put it simply, how much work is going to be involved for the developers to fully utilize this thing? Because that, at the end of the day, is going to be a massive issue. We know from what Microsoft have leaked and said that the move engines, just for example, of the Xbox One, which of course are the fixed function accelerators, they're fixed function because no one has to tell them to do anything. They just do their job, they're just chilling, and, developers don't have to worry they even exist. But we're not really sure about the same for the ESRAM. Now, if tiled resources is to be believed, 3 gigabytes worth of textures, 3 gigs, just to clarify, worth of texture data can fit in just 16 megabytes of memory. This has been according to what Microsoft themselves have said. So let's give them the benefit of the doubt that this is the case. The problem is the frame buffer at 1080p does take a lot of memory itself. So, as I said, there is some conflicting reports of what's going on, whether it's a cache, whether it's a software, whether it's a managed cache, whether it's a scratch pad. A scratch pad, by the way, just to quickly clarify, by the way, you can of course Google this yourselves, but it's basically a high-speed piece of memory, and it's used to temporarily store things such as calculations and things basically that are currently being calculated, which of course is really important in regards to, for example, compute functionality and creating of scenes and so on, because you could imagine just how much data is being passed backwards and forwards. Most people agree that if it's used as a cache or a scratch pad, in theory, and once again, theory is not necessarily equal to reality, that it should be enough for 1080p. Now, as it turns out, and it might not sound it when you first say it, but believe me, it's true, that the actual amount of pixels from 1280 by 720, that, my friends, is known as, of course, 720p, compared to 1920 by 1080 is actually 2.25 times larger. You can actually do that math yourself if you don't believe me. You could simply times 1280 by 720, and then you can times that by 2.25, and then you could divide that by, say, 1920, and you'll come up with 1080, just for example. And so, as I said, 1280 by 720 equals about 7 megabytes. That's assuming 8-bit channels, and 1920 by 1080 equals 2.25 times bigger. By the way, just to clarify, this is without anti-aliasing. And so you're looking at a smidgen, if you will, under 16 megabytes. And of course, that's just enough for double buffering to prevent, for example, screen tearing and so forth. So there you have it. There are a lot of different questions regarding ESRAM. I'm sure I'm missing probably a couple. So the invariable question, the question of the ages, I'm going to be asked is, what do I think of this? Do I think that Microsoft are lying? Well, I don't know. I know that's a very crappy answer, but see, everyone's really quick to judge this stuff, but the bottom line is, right now, we don't have enough information to know everything. And if you don't know everything, it's very difficult to really give an accurate assessment. I agree that there are some parts of this I don't understand. For example, I don't understand how they're getting the maximum peak. I don't really get that. We know, as far as what we understand anyway, that they've got a 1024-bit bus, which is feeding this. That's basically how you do the calculation anyway. We know, the memory bandwidth made sense until they ramped up the clock speed. Maybe they just decided, you know what, we're just going to keep it like that because we think that's realistic, or what. There's definitely some questions regarding that. Now, you'll notice that this video is like 26 minutes long right now, and I've only just gotten into all of the ESRAM questions. There are a lot more besides. And this is just an example of how big this subject is, because people could debate this until they're blue in the face. They could debate it until they're, 100. There are a lot of exciting things about this generation, but until we really know more about it, I think a lot of the stuff is going to remain mysteries. I will, of course, be finishing off this series because I've started, and so I will. But the more we go into this, the more it obviously becomes more of a mystery. For example, Intel, when they were discussing the GT3E, that's Iris Pro 5200, they actually went with 128 megabytes of EDRAM. Now, Intel said, and I quote, that they didn't find much of a benefit beyond 32 megabytes, but it designed it to be future-proof. And Intel basically went with the notion of, okay, what we're going to do, we're going to double it, and then we're going to double it again. So they quite literally, they decided to go big or go home. And that was actually from Intel's Tom Piazza. I'm hoping I pronounced that right. That is a Tom, obviously T-O-M, and then P-I-A-Z-Z-A. So I'll just repeat that one more time. P-I-A-Z-Z-A. So they basically went with the motto that they're going to go with how much memory they've got now, that they believe games require. They doubled it to basically go with the future, and then that obviously brings them up to 64, and then they decided to double it yet again for extra, well, this will just make sure that we never have any issues with memory. So, if you take a little bit of thought here, Intel seemed to think that 32 megabytes as a cache is enough. Intel seemed to think so. But Intel also seemed to think that that's for now. That's the key. Right, let's assume that you are Electronic Arts, right? You're Electronic Arts, you're developing a game, whatever that game is, it doesn't matter. Say the next Battlefield, so Battlefield 5, just for example, or, a completely new IP, right? Doesn't matter. And you're developing or changing your Frostbite engine, or your Crytek, it doesn't matter who you are, right? But you're developing a graphically intensive game. You don't know necessarily now. So as it stands, late 2013, late half 2013, you can't predict 2 to 3 years time how game engines will want to change, especially as we know that games are going to become increasingly graphically intensive. A lot of people point out stuff like, well, look how fantastic games like The Last of Us look like on the PlayStation 3. And that had a crummy design. The PS3 had quite a few issues regarding the cell processor and memory. But you know what? Despite my love affair for The Last of Us, holy crap did that game have some problems. It looks beautiful. There's no doubt that far away things look really good. But the game had issues, and anyone who says differently just hasn't been paying attention. I'm sorry, that's just my personal opinion. The game is a fantastic title, but there were issues, right? And I say this as a fan of the game, but there were issues on the frame rate. Specifically, the fact that when it got busy, in other words, lots of debris on screen, a lot of physics, that type of thing, yeah, the frame rate. That's all I have to say. The frame rate was just down. I mean, I didn't have a frame per second indicator running while I was playing it when it got really busy. But there were sections, and I'm pretty sure it went to like 20 frames per second. It really stuttered. And you can also tell low-resolution textures as well, specifically on certain characters and or some scenery. And you can actually see the textures really pop into notice, especially for quick turning. So let's assume, for example, you're not looking, and then you quickly turn the camera. Sometimes you can really catch the engine surprised, and you can just see that texture pop up, and yeah, it doesn't look good. So that's just my point. I'm just saying that it's sometimes better to future-proof. But anyway, this video I think is just about done. I've spoken about everything that I can think of in this video. I've possibly missed something. If so, I'll amend it on the next video. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. At least it's given you some food for thought. I am really curious about what you think about it. The situation, of course. Feel free to contact me on Facebook. That would be facebook.com/redgamingtech. I will do my best to message you at a reasonable point in time. I get a lot of messages, so if I don't respond to you instantly, it's not an affront to you or whatever. It's simply because I am getting swamped recently. I do try to respond to everyone. I just can't promise that it will be in the next 24 hours, but I will get back to you. Anyway, oh, by the way, if you've seen that it has been read and no one's responded, give it like a couple of hours, the message, and if someone's still not responded, just, give me a reminder, because it's possible that someone else on the channel, because as I said, there's a couple of us reading it, so address it to Paul, or /Crimson Rain, that's me. And if someone else has read it, then it will be refreshed, and I know, okay, that someone actually has messaged me, because sometimes it might be something for someone contacting like a martyr or something like that. So anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I'm going to get going. It's been a ridiculously lengthy video, but hopefully it's given you guys a food for thought anyway. I will see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.